I'm trying to think of a headline about what we talked about that people will actually want to watch, and everyone's being an asshole instead. Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week we talk with John Wood, a friend of mine. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about the toxic conversation and partisan warfare where everyone's trying to destroy each other, and why free speech and community and a little bit of empathy is the only way we're going to get out of this mess. Check it out. John, good to see you again.
Matt, good to see you too, buddy.
We had an awesome conversation yesterday, and I think we met maybe 6 months ago online having a conversation about race, and maybe we'll get into that. But why don't you introduce yourself for people that don't know who John Wood is? What's your deal?
That's right. Well, so most people right now know me because I'm a spokesperson for an organization called Better Angels. Better Angels is a national nonprofit organization. It's basically the biggest bipartisan group in America, grassroots volunteer organization dedicated to the work of what you might call political depolarization, but really increasingly sort of the work of establishing or reestablishing a sense of shared community and shared identity among Americans from across the political divide. So there's a lot of ways in which we sort of go about that work. The thing that most people are familiar with us for is something called a red and blue workshop model, where we basically take small groups of folks from the left and from the right. We bring them into a shared space, not so much to argue or debate about politics exactly, but rather to speak from the vantage point of their own sort of life experience in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. So basically, in a nutshell, we're applying marriage counseling techniques to political conversation.
Yeah.
Right. But we do a whole lot more than that. I mean, we've got local Better Angels alliances across the country, basically chapters that are bipartisan, that are made up of people who've been through some of our programs, who come together, and they basically look for areas of possible policy agreement where they can pursue projects or support candidates or campaigns in their own communities, and essentially sort of building out a bipartisan infrastructure across the country and on college campuses that principally gives people an opportunity to get to know each other, again, past the stereotypes, but also provides avenues for people to work together where they can find avenues to areas in which they might want to do that. So that's what Better Angels is about. And before that, I've done a few other things. Of course, I'm a contributor for Quillette and Ario Magazine and a few other publications. But prior to all of that, I was the vice chairman of the Republican Party in Los Angeles and a nominee for Congress in 2014. I ran against Maxine Waters in that election cycle. And those are the highlights.
You ran against Maxine Waters.
I did, yeah.
How was that?
That was fun, man.
How was being a Republican in L.A. County?
That's also fun. You stand out.
Yeah.
You know, you get to put your unicorn horn on, basically, and have people say, "I didn't realize that you exist," more or less. You know. Yeah. So I was 26 years old when I was running against Congresswoman Waters, and I still live actually in South Central Los Angeles, and first of all, I wound up doing better than any Republican or Democrat who had run against Maxine. And I mentioned that as a point of fact. Truth is, it's not really saying much. I'm the only person to scratch the underside of 30%. Part of that had to do with redistricting. The district lines were redrawn to bring in a pocket of conservatives in the South Bay, so that helped. But the other part of it was that I ran my campaign essentially in the inner city overwhelmingly, knocking on doors in Inglewood and Watts and places like that. And, my reasons for running had less to do with opposing Maxine Waters, although both in terms of policy and sort of the way, I believe politics ought to be conducted. Had
demeanor?
Yeah, demeanor, right?
Yeah.
You can say that, demeanor, behavior. I have major points of difference between myself and Congresswoman Waters. But my major point in running was to, one, introduce a new vision of what politics, a new policy vision to the community, something that had less to do with, depending on the kind of apparatuses of the state for subsistence and opportunity, and more to do with kind of cultivating our capacity to build up opportunities for ourselves on the community level. And two, to introduce a new cultural narrative to the conversation, one that was based less on demonizing whether we're white or black or left or right, based less on our demonizing one another on the basis of our party affiliation or what views we ascribe to each other on account of race, and more on sort of returning to a way of relating to each other that focuses on our individual characters and getting to know the histories, our personal histories behind our political points of view. And so the coalition behind my campaign, I mean, we didn't raise a lot of money. We weren't able to buy a lot of airtime. But if you go back and look at the team that I put together and the race that I ran, it was a thoroughly bipartisan, multicultural sort of campaign on my part. My policy objectives were by and large fairly, right of center. But even at that, I was able to assemble a group of supporters who wanted to see politics done a different way, fundamentally in terms of reintroducing some empathy to the conversation. So that's where my mission in political life really began.
So not to compare you to taking on Goliath, but I feel like your two goals that you just laid out to eliminate sort of the mean partisanship that's tearing our country apart, and to defeat Maxine Waters in southern Los Angeles. These feel like not small projects.
Right, yeah.
So you're not afraid of breaking some eggs.
No, not really. But I also don't really look at those things as all that dramatic, so to speak. I mean, I know it sort of sounds like a big thing to undertake when you just sort of lay it out like that, but for me, it was just a sensible sort of thing to do, given what I care about in just political life, but just in American life in general. I did misstate something a second ago. I said that that's where my political sort of mission began, and that was when I first sort of stepped onto the battlefield in a visible kind of way. But I sort of, if I go back in time a little bit, I was always interested in politics, but as an adult, my first sort of foray into politics was working for Obama's campaign in 2008. So I grew up a Democrat, really. And I was very much taken with the message of Obama's campaign in 2008 because I was taken with the idea that, as he stated in his keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in 2004, this idea that we are not a Black America, white America, or Latino America. We are the United States, that there's not a red America or a blue America, but we are all Americans. I saw that perspective as essentially being in line with the ethos of Martin Luther King Jr. and this idea that in order for this nation to live up to its greater potential, we needed to sort of transcend judgment on the basis of race, and also King would have also agreed political party, and to return to a more fundamental way of assessing each other as human beings on the basis of our shared humanity. So that launched me back into politics, and interestingly, as a part of an effort to kind of continue what I felt the Obama, message was about after he was elected, I made a conscientious decision to kind of study and explore conservatism. And so I started reading books that I'd never read before, things like Atlas Shrugged and Wealth of Nations, and Bible for that matter, cover to cover. A little bit of a different subject because I was also in the midst of a religious conversion at the time, and kind of found that after a while, and I also started studying African American history from a more conservative point of view as well. And after a while, just sort of stopped and reevaluated my sort of where I landed on a list of, say, 50 or to 100 policy issues and cultural issues. And I realized that, on at least 62 or 65 of these things, I fall kind of, on the right side of the line. And so, but the thing I never stopped doing was trying to open people's eyes up to the idea that there really is sort of common humanity on both sides of these questions, and areas of truth that are available to be learned from on both sides. And so I ran for Congress, and I've done the things I've done since then, just because if I wasn't doing that, I wouldn't know what to do with myself, basically. I'm a person who has to act on what I think is morally right, really. And for me, it comes down to kind of spreading the culture of understanding in our conversation, because I just think that America is just collapsing under the weight of our inability to recognize the humanity in one another. And I know that sounds a little bit generic or cliche, but I don't think anything could be more real in this moment.
So we met. We met doing a online. I don't know what the platform was, but let's call it a Skype conversation between 6 people with an organization called Living Room Conversations. Our mutual friend Joan Blades.
That's right.
Former founder of MoveOn.org.
That's right. Yeah.
Is working on something not unlike what Better Angels is trying to accomplish. They create either virtual or actual living room conversations between people from across the ideological perspective, different cultural perspectives, skin colors, and we were talking about race, and the thing that really got my attention when you were talking was the sort of the unique history of your upbringing and how that's a metaphor for everything you're trying to do. Tell people a little bit about your mom and dad.
Right. Yeah. So some people have heard me say this, but I had a bit of a canned line that I would use when I was running for Congress. So whether I was speaking to a black Democratic church in South Los Angeles, South LA, or to a white Tea Party club in South Bay, LA County, I'd frequently lead with the same opener. I'd tell people, I'd say, well, people ask me at the age of 26, what makes you qualified to run against Maxine Waters and to represent a district as, diverse and intricate. It's the California 43rd. And I'd tell people, I'd say, well, I have sort of a unique family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father is a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father and my mother, and my mother and my father, and that's why I think I can represent a lot of you, right? And so it was usually good for a laugh, and it kind of got the point across. The truth is a little bit more nuanced than that, though. My dad never particularly liked that opening line because it was more technically true than anything. My dad grew up a Democrat, grew up in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles, and didn't become conservative and a Republican until later in life. But he was born in Tennessee, and so I come from a musical family. On my mother's side, my mom was an R&B singer, danced on Soul Train in the 80s. One of my uncles on my mother's side was one of the biggest gangster rappers in America. A guy named name was Mac 10, his rap name. It was part of a group called West Side Connection, which was Ice Cube's group after he left NWA. And but on my father's side, my dad is a jazz pianist who grew up, loving and admiring jazz music and just American music in general, raised me with that. And say a little bit more about that in a second. But my grandfather, his father, was one of the biggest record industry executives in America. He owned the biggest independent record label in the United States in the 1950s and early 60s. That was Dot Records. And so Dot had 36 million sellers. Its biggest artist was Pat Boone, who was the number one selling pop artist of the 1950s. Number one was Elvis Presley, right? So just put that in context. Yep. And prior to Dot, Grandpa had a radio show. It was actually a mail-order record shop that sponsored a radio show called the Randy's Record Shop. And it was the first radio show to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel, basically black music, to a national audience. And as I mentioned to you the other day, on a clear night, the signal would travel clean into the Caribbean. And from what I understand, Bob Marley grew up, Bob Marley recorded some of his first hits at a recording studio called Randy's, which was named after the radio station and indirectly after my grandfather, therefore. Yeah. And so that radio show launched the careers of people like Mahalia Jackson and Arthur Alexander and Solomon Burke and so forth. Fats Domino called my grandfather on, probably his 87th or 88th birthday or something like that, and sang him happy birthday on the phone. Grandpa died in 2011, but some years before that, he got that call. And my dad tells me that Solomon Burke came and visited my grandfather's recording studio in Los Angeles, probably in the 70s or 80s, and he took the picture of Grandpa off the wall and kissed it and said, "I owe this man $100,000 or something like that." And he was referring to the opportunities that came to him through the music that was played on the radio show. And so you can argue that Grandpa was sort of like the foremost figure in terms of facilitating the crossover of black music into the mainstream kind of music marketplace in the country. I mean, he was one of the main guys who sort of drove that, and that was not just because of the Randy's Record Shop. It was also because Pat Boone's early hits were covers of Fats Domino songs and Little Richard songs. Well, Ain't It a Shame and Ain't That a Shame and Tutti Frutti in particular, you know. Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, ooh. Yeah, Pat had that real kind of slow version, if you recall that, you know. And so he gets...
Of course he did.
Yeah, right, exactly. Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy. So, you know, I grew up listening to all of that stuff. And the thing that made my upbringing pretty amazing...
So you're literally immersed in music and the way that black culture and white culture are coming together through music.
That's my background, really, prior to politics. I mean, that's what I was raised in. And it's a funny thing because I'm, you know, I mean, obviously I'm biracial and from a multicultural family, actually. But, you know, my dad, as a white man, raised me very conscientiously to be proud of being black, not for its own sake, but because African American music and musical culture and heritage in the United States was just a central part in my father's view of what made America great, right? And so this is part of what I would tell people when I was running for Congress and when I was running in the sort of inner city community in particular, because, you know, even before Trump, 2014, you had, you know, the Tea Party and, you know, Mitt Romney had just run and lost against Barack Obama, but there was this, you know, this virulent sense that Republicans and, you know, conservatives are people who, by and large, are either carrying water for racists or were racist themselves. And that campaign gave me an opportunity to talk about, you know, my experience with my own father, to say basically that, well, look, you know, my dad is a white person who, you know, voted for Romney, who is, you know, sympathetic to the Tea Party and whose politics, you know, he's a white conservative, you know, grew up in the 50s and so forth. You might have certain assumptions about him based on that, and yet my dad's big heroes in life growing up were Willie Mays and Muhammad Ali and Bill Evans, who was a white jazz pianist who came to fame playing with John Coltrane and Miles Davis, right?
Yep.
And I make the case that, you know, he's my father, and he loves me and my brother more than anything in life, right? And it was a useful and important story to be able to tell, because when we get sucked into this thing of seeing everybody as existing in some kind of, you know, archetypal kind of distortion of their character on the basis of their politics, we can't see individuals anymore. And I think that's largely what's happened in this country, is we can't see each other as individuals because we can't get past the labels, and we've lost any sense of what connects us as Americans beyond some of these differences.
So do you think, so let's dig a little bit deeper on that, because we have a lot of agreement on these issues and trying to get people to consider each other's arguments, regardless of your political party or your skin color or what town you're from, whatever the tribal separation is, and we say that we see that there's polarization. We see that people no longer can hear what the other person's saying because of preconceived notions about who they are. Right. But is that everybody? Is that us, or is that certain leaders that want to kind of manipulate us? Right. And politics is great at this, right? It's great at manipulating us not to vote for me, but to vote against those guys, because those guys are going to destroy this country.
Right, yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that on the one hand, the structures are set up in a way to where, whether you're talking about the political parties themselves, the media establishments, even the way I think to a degree universities are increasingly operating, there's a degree to which within the formal kind of political classes, power is derived through polarization, through making sure that people are balkanized and tribalized, so that on the one hand you're able to leverage people in opposition against one another, while on the other hand, through people's fear and distrust of each other, prevent them from looking as critically as they might at the institutions that they're supporting or at the news channel that they're patronizing, because of the fact that they're just too wrapped up in opposing the other group to notice what's going on in their own camp, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the incentive structure that exists, I think, in the media and in the parties, and it makes the type of social progress that I think we want to see much more difficult. But I also think that those systems couldn't work that way if it weren't the case that there were not honest disagreements that existed between the American people that were genuinely intractable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, this country was built on deep-seated philosophical disagreements. But you fast forward a couple hundred years, you introduce the massive sort of influx of information technology, increase our own ability to sort of silo off the information we receive, the way in which we communicate with one another. You begin to suck the life out of local communities so that neighbors don't talk to each other anymore. And you insert massive sort of demographic change over the course of several decades in a way that introduces, new cultures and new ways of speaking and looking at the world and so forth that don't always translate across these experiential lines from one group to another. Well, even without the perverse kind of incentive structure of the political establishment, you've still got a recipe for major misunderstanding between people. So, it's a problem that has to be changed, that has to be engaged on the structural level, but even more so, I think, or even more fundamentally, on the cultural level. And so that does tend to be where I focus a lot of my energy in both of those directions, but I do think that culture is the foundation where you have to begin.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about a piece you just wrote for Quillette about communitarianism.
Right.
And I proceed this by pointing out that I find all of these words that we use to identify ourselves, and I was a Tea Partier. I identify as a libertarian so that people know where I'm coming from. But I think both those words have a lot of ambiguity and baggage and confusion, and
Right.
and what you hear when I say that is not exactly what I meant. I feel the same way about communitarian, but you're describing the bottom up culture that created both the entrepreneurship and the sense of belonging that I associate with jazz.
Yeah.
And that to me was a very communitarian thing.
Right.
It was very bottom up. It was
Yeah.
very, but it was also very disruptive. And those two things together create beautiful things.
Right. Yeah.
And when I hear communitarian, I hear that, but there's a whole history there. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, you're right. People have all these different ways of interpreting these phrases. When I say communitarian, I definitely don't mean anything particularly left or particularly right. I mean, essentially a philosophy of social engagement that begins at the community level, that begins with looking at the relationships that exist between people in the context of a community where you have basic sort of foundational institutions, including the family, including business, including ministry, including schools. And you have a culture that exists between these institutions that is only as strong as the people within that community's ability to relate to one another and care for one another across whatever lines may exist of personal or group difference within the context of a community, right? And so it's funny because that article that I wrote for Quillette, I mean, the upshot of that piece was basically that there is sort of a revival, I think, taking place right now of communitarian sorts of sentiments that are visible across the sort of left-right divide in America at the moment. And it's true from Senator Mike Lee's work with the Social Capital Summit to much of Cornell West lecturing and teaching alongside conservative professor Robert P. George on the importance of interpersonal and intergroup empathy, and the heterodox work of Jonathan Haidt, and the focus of groups like the American Project, which I work with, which is dedicated to sort of reintroducing sort of community-based values to the mainstream conservative movement. And then the entire sort of depolarization space, Better Angels, Living Room Conversations, Joan Blades you mentioned. There are all these groups and thinkers popping up across the boards who are realizing the fact that, I guess the way I would describe it is that the thing that threatens us most as a country right now is not so much the long-term prospects of the economy, although obviously that is a major thing, or our ability to cope with the debt and deficit, or maintain our national security, although all of these things are existential. But the major thing threatening the long-term ability of this nation to survive is our ability to cohere as a community capable of maintaining the culture upon which healthy political institutions can exist.
Yeah.
So in other words, if we're always trying to sabotage each other as human beings, we're not going to play by the rules of the game. We're going to launch investigations into one another that are not born out of good faith or not considered on the basis of justice, but rather on the basis of political expediency. We're going to lie, we're going to cheat, we're going to steal, and systems fall apart when that becomes the cultural norm. And so I wrote that piece trying to shine a light on folks from Van Jones to Ben Sass across the spectrum who are working in this constructive direction, Glenn Beck. And many people on both sides appreciated it. Many people on both sides had a real problem with it, interestingly enough.
Well, that might, I mean, that might be a good thing. If you've written something that didn't upset anybody, you were probably doing clickbait, and shame on you. So
Sure. Right.
It's funny, like my friends across the political spectrum, I'm thinking of a mutual friend of ours who's very progressive, and she shared with me what was basically a libertarian strategy for getting our politics out of Washington and taking it back to the community and focusing on the bottom up. And I think, and Mike Lee has written this as a conservative, he thinks that federalism is the key to allowing people to be different, and only when you're allowed to be different can you find those common things that bind us together. But she was making a more sort of anarcho-capitalist libertarian thing. I don't think she knew it. This is Deborah Lynn.
Okay.
And she's basically saying that Washington, D.C. is never going to solve our problems. It's got to be done at the community level. It's got to be a responsibility that each of us has to get to know our neighbors, to understand where they're coming from, and to solve those problems by taking that individual responsibility, not by hiring a lobbyist or voting and hoping that some politician's going to solve all our problems.
Right.
I think that's one of the upsides to the downside of our dysfunctional, partisan, angry thing, because people are hopefully looking in the mirror and saying, you know what, I guess I got to do this myself.
Right.
I think that's okay. I think that part is healthy.
Right. Yeah. No, and it's something that it's something that it gets back to civic fundamentals, right? We have kind of gotten to a point, in my view, where we look at all political progress as breaking down over binary choices over federal policy, right? And there are such choices that need to be made, and they certainly matter, But a lot of times, you'll have a policy that does or does not go through on the federal level that winds up becoming damaging, not so much because of what the policy itself is doing or is trying to do, but because of sort of the vicious torrent of social and political response that it sets off that kind of catalyzes this race to the bottom, where both sides find way to beat each other in ways that, again, undermine the integrity of the larger system, of the larger structure. And
I want to win the D.C. lottery so that I can finally get a hold of power and punish those guys that have been punishing me all those years.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And that is not that's not a sound governing philosophy to me. But it also bespeaks a culture that has become, to use a word that maybe people use too much, but it speaks a culture that's become toxic, basically, And And yet, you do find people. I think that this is largely why you have, say, an intellectual dark web space to begin with. I mean, you do have people on the left and on the right, I think, who want to get back to the basic fundamentals of interpersonal decency and community building, ultimately.
Yeah.
And, if we're able to do that, it doesn't guarantee that one side or the other is going to win the next election. But I think it does guarantee ultimately that we'll be able to preserve the republic, we'll be able to preserve democracy for the next generation. And that's the kind of deeper kind of battle that I'm fighting.
That was, the intellectual dark web in a lot of ways, or at least the trends that helped create the intellectual dark web were precisely the things that inspired me to start this show.
Right.
Because Blaze TV, we're a conservative network, and I stick out a little bit because I'm the flagship libertarian.
Sure. Right.
But the
so you
thing,
get it from all sides, basically.
Libertarians are very good at disappointing everybody, and some of this is self-inflicted. Some of it is absolutely our fault.
Sure.
But that trend, I think, is sort of the counter revolution against the. Originally we had these romantic hopes that the internet was going to democratize everything and connect us all, and everything was going to be beautiful. Well, it's not quite that awesome yet. And so the counter revolution was just a bunch of angry clickbait where we create caricatures of our enemies and click yes and share. But the intellectual dark web and the trend of young people, they're fleeing Facebook, and they're curating content, and they're consuming things that in part are dictated by the open-mindedness and the tone of it, right?
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, so there are two things that are striking about that right off the bat. The one thing is, yes, there's a desire for conversations that range out beyond the echo chamber, right? And so that's a fundamental appeal of the intellectual dark web space. I mean, you really do have people coming from as far to the right as Ben Shapiro and as far to the left as my friends Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, who are able to come together and have not just heterodox conversations or bipartisan conversations, but deep conversations about not about policy to be certain, but also deeper questions about culture and morality and even evolution, religion, and science. So all that's fascinating, but it leads to the second thing, which is striking, which is that these conversations are not soundbite conversations, typically. They go deep, and in some cases, they go several hours. Like you gotta,
2 to 3 hours.
Yeah, you got. I mean, if you're not a trucker, you're not going to be able to listen to some of these conversations.
And by the way, it's young people listening to this.
Yes, that's the thing. It's young people listening.
I resent anyone that has 3 hours to dive deep into a conversation. But.
Right, exactly. And so, but I've been one of these people who's been, recently, just this thing about being so busy with the work that I do, it's hard for me to keep up now. But, I certainly spent a fair amount of time listening to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and watching this space congeal into a conversational culture where everybody seemed to be welcome as long as you're willing to play by the rules of good faith interaction and good faith dialogue. And that's in line with the values that I brought to politics when I ran for Congress in 2014, and it's in line with the strong aspect of what we try to do in the work of Better Angels. One thing I would say is that there does seem to be sort of a fairly firm dividing line drawn within certain areas in the intellectual dark web, and for reasons I can understand, between folks who value free speech and folks who value reason and folks who have a certain social justice oriented worldview or an embrace of identity politics wherein they just can't have a reasonable conversation because they can't get past the sort of need to call out certain individuals for their relative privilege on the basis of race or power or gender or whatever the case may be. And so that's a serious divide in our social and our political conversation. But I do believe that as much as I would agree and feel that there are some serious difficulties with that way of seeing not just America broadly, but that way of looking at conversations, that the rules of a conversation should change depending on what the power balance or imbalance is. I do think that it's important to kind of look at emotionally and experientially where folks in that camp are coming from. And when I speak to people in that camp, I try to make the same case going the other way and basically say to people on all sides, look, the greatest moral revolution in this country's history, I believe, was accomplished over the course of the nonviolent movement and the civil rights movement in the civil rights era, as led by Martin Luther King Jr. And in the philosophy that he articulated, the nonviolent philosophy, what Dr. King stressed was the need for us, whether or not we, in disagreements with other parties, and even if we are being oppressed by other parties, to begin our interactions with others and even our opposition to others with the recognition of the fundamental human dignity that exists in the person on the other side. One is a means of more effectively reaching out to that person's conscience and swaying that person's mind if you can. But even if you can't, as a means of unshackling yourself from the burden of bitterness and hatred and fear that tends to accompany the kind of prejudice that we so often bring to social and political conversations. I mean, whether we're right or wrong. Right?
Yeah, one of those rules of conversation, I think, and I'm sure someone has said this well, but this idea of trying to actually understand what the other person is arguing.
Right.
And I've found just a couple of years ago when I started hanging out with my new progressive friends, as much as I was trying, I had a hard time understanding sometimes what they were trying to say. Mm-hmm. So just being aware that, particularly, the words we were just mentioning before, capitalism versus socialism, communitarian, Republican, conservative, all of these things, Tea Party, Libertarian, they'll have preconceived meanings that aren't necessarily going to get you to the truth of what that person's trying to say.
Right. And understanding the fact that you can be using the same words, but in effect speaking a different language, a different ideological language, that is key to having a conversation that's productive, is sort of keying in on the places where that's the case. I have a friend, my friend Peter Boghossian has a book out called How to Have Impossible Conversations. And it's a great sort of guidebook for sort of having a productive and kind of empathetic dialogue, even with people who have radically differing opinions. And one of the basic kind of pieces of advice he offers, him and James Lindsay, his co-author, one of the basic pieces of advice they offer in that book is to look at the person on the other side of the conversation as not being an opponent, but being a partner with you, being a partner in the search for truth. Because, I mean, even if the other individual sees things in a dramatically different way, if you treat the conversation the right way, if you're able to ask the right questions to get that person to kind of shine a light on why they see things the way they do, they're going to add to your ability to understand other people. And they may also show themselves to have a perspective on a certain question that completes some element of your understanding of an issue that maybe needed to be completed and you didn't realize it going into it. To me, that's politics. I mean, granted, I mean, politics is a matter of
it's an ideal. It's a very idealized.
Well, I was gonna say
for politics.
I was gonna say yes. I mean, obviously, on a more kind of essential level. I mean, politics is this rough kind of interaction of self-interest where we deliberate over how to organize our common society based in part upon, just sort of the leverage that competing interests are able to wield against each other in the context of negotiation. But I think that the founders of this country, in creating our constitutional system, set our system up in a way to where it would establish itself as a check against the worst impulses of human nature, while also rewarding those people who would want to engage in dialogue and deliberation in the civic process according to the better angels of our nature. Pardon me for throwing in the reference.
That's nice plug there.
Indeed. But the truth is that the founding fathers believed that you needed a bedrock of virtue in the population to maintain civic society. And they were under no illusions about human nature, but they saw it at its depths and they saw it at its noblest. And so I think that in our own time, we ought to be mindful of the inevitable fact that, people, even, people who are reasonable and decent much of the time are going to have moments where they're triggered towards behaving in ways that are, abominable from time to time. And maybe some people are like that much of the time. But we also have this capacity for reason, and we also have this capacity for love, frankly, and for genuine understanding that can govern us in the direction that are the ingredients of self-governance that can allow us to govern our society in a wiser kind of way. And to me, that's the direction we want to be pushing the conversation. And, my job in part is to find folks who are interested in rowing that same direction and get them to start rowing together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, the methodology you laid out for having a conversation, I feel like that sort of openness to the process of figuring stuff out is the basis of freedom, the way I think about it. It's the basis of the American system, and it's not just how we sort things out in the public square. It's how we figure stuff out at the community level. It's how entrepreneurs disrupt marketplaces. And maybe that's the basis for why there is, and I think it's a small minority in this country that have become adamantly anti-free speech. Mm-hmm. They don't want to hear what their opponent has to say, right. and your friend suffered that at Evergreen.
Right.
But I was sort of surprised by how violent the reaction was against the intellectual dark web, because I thought we all, I naively thought we all agreed that free speech was a good thing and that open conversation was a good thing, very American things.
Right.
But now there's a very authoritarian, and it's mostly on the left, that the right's guilty of this too. The right wants to censor Facebook just as much as Elizabeth Warren wants to break it up. So,
right.
But this push against speech, I think this is one of the most dangerous things in America today.
Mm-hmm. Right. But I do think it reflects a couple of things. I mean, the viewpoint itself is worth remarking upon. Now, I don't think it's most people on the left by any means who have sort of a generalized antipathy towards free speech as an instrument of the patriarchy, right? But you do have a sizable contingent of activists who I think are concentrated on not just college campuses in general, because I don't think you find this at community colleges too much or at most state colleges. I mean, Evergreen obviously would be an exception, but I think at elite universities in particular, Yale, you might probably remember the professor from Yale, I think Nicholas Christakis, who was, hounded in a pretty radical sort of way. You find in certain places in elite universities, pockets of people who feel that debate and free speech itself are mechanisms by which, the white supremacist or the patriarchal power structure maintains its power, right? And the thought process that leads to that point of view is one, I think, that is born in part from a frustration that certain people have over the fact that when it comes to the culture of governance, like all other institutions in the United States and anywhere, really, all of our institutions have sort of a cultural ancestry, even regardless of the color composition that make up the people in an institution at any certain period of time. When I was growing up, my dad was very adamant that I speak the King's English. That was a phrase that he used. And if I came home, speaking like I had just walked off the set of 106 in Park or something like that, BET, right? If I wound up, speaking in a certain way that was it sounded like I was trying to imitate my favorite rapper. I wasn't allowed to listen to rap, by the way, at my father's house. I'd get in trouble for that. My dad would say, speak like Martin Luther King Jr., And that's connected to this a little bit, because for many people who come from communities that they feel are, outside of the kind of cultural heritage from which our institutions seem to descend, then they feel like there's almost literally a language or a dialect of power, right? And so people are trying to change the rules of conversation to reflect power imbalance, in part because they don't see themselves as having a fair purchase on the culture or the heritage of literally just our democratic institutions themselves. And so it's hard to see that from the outside when all you hear are just these triggering phrases like white privilege and white supremacy and patriarchy, etc. But it is important to start to understand that narrative a little bit to begin to understand how we can go about communicating with that point of view.
It's an interesting dynamic, given that by any sort of objective historical measure, the minority voice is radically empowered today, because you don't need to get on a TV network, and you don't even need a political party in order to express your opinions, and yet it seems to be a double-edged sword for people that still feel disenfranchised, that they don't have the power to speak.
Right. Yeah. Well, it is. It's true that it's easy to gain a fair amount of attention if you're willing to do something wild, right? If you're willing to shut down a campus, or maybe block a freeway, or say something radical on YouTube or what have you. And it's also true that in most respects, people from various communities, including African Americans and other ethnic minorities and gay Americans, etc., enjoy more opportunities, more wealth on average, and just a higher quality of life in most categories, and more consistent access to rights and equal protection under the law than had been the case in just a few decades ago, really, right? And so we look at that on a surface level and think, well, the complaints and the grievances of underrepresentation and not having the opportunity to express oneself seem to be at odds with this increase in affluence and the fact that, hey, we all hear you, right? We all hear what it is you guys are saying on these college campuses. As a matter of fact, we feel like we can't get away from it. And that's partially why we're listening to Ben Shapiro, and partly why we're listening to Jordan Peterson, etc. But from the vantage point of people who live in certain communities, and there are fine distinctions to be made between some activists, I think, who posture themselves as representing people who are marginalized, or who they would say are marginalized, and people who are actually living in tough circumstances and kind of being held up as as victims by that group. So it would take us a minute to sift through all that, but it's definitely true that there are people living in the United States of America today who, regardless of everything else I just said, still live in a situation to where they are kind of locked in a series of institutional relationships that prevents them from having the educational opportunity, the economic opportunity, the social mobility, or the community connection necessary to have anything resembling a reasonable shot at the American dream. So I lived in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts for about a year or so. And there's a whole story behind that. I married a woman who grew up in the Jordan Downs and whose family was from the Jordan Downs. And Matt, I met people, young men, in the projects in Los Angeles, who were my age, like early 20s and whatnot, early to mid 20s. This is not long before I ran for Congress, who had never been to the beach in Santa Monica, just a few miles away. I mean, we're sitting here in Washington, D.C. now. I'm sure I can find all sorts of people out here who who've been to Malibu, right? Who've been to Santa Monica. But for people living in this place, the only experience they've had with white people, right? Or most of the people outside of the community that they live in there, outside of the inner city community, the only experience they've had with white people have been through overburdened or indifferent school teachers, bureaucrats who are overwrought and and don't necessarily put any passion or commitment into their work because they've just been sucked in as cogs of a soulless bureaucratic system, or police who have been hardened by working in a tough and aggressive environment, who oftentimes are not really interested in cutting somebody the benefit of the doubt when they pull somebody over who just happens to be, making a U-turn at the wrong intersection at the wrong time and happens to look suspicious whether or not they're actually doing anything wrong or not. These are the sorts of social relationships that they have that make them think that the wider community outside of the projects is not one that they're going to be comfortable just walking into. Because in a sense, once you get outside of the hood, you're kind of an alien in your own city, in your own state, in your own country. And if you go back in terms of the historical experience of somebody living in that sort of place, they only have to look back a generation to find parents and relatives who were, victims of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s or the political violence of the 60s. People whose family moved out from the South to the West Coast to escape, racist violence there, only to find themselves victims of redlining in Los Angeles or, police brutality, depending on what part of the city you were in the 1950s as an African American. Go back a generation or two before that. You have people who lived in the South who remember the Klan, and before that, whose parents were slaves. Their entire American experience is characterized by a series of struggles and difficulties at each and every stage of which they or their ancestors did not seem to have an equal purchase on opportunity or on the American dream, right? And so we shouldn't necessarily expect everybody in this country to have the same kind of psychological starting point in terms of embracing the norms of democratic culture, right? We have to constantly be trying to win our own people over as Americans to the values of these ideas, to the values of liberty, to the values of freedom of speech. And we've got to know how to more effectively communicate with each other in doing it, as opposed to just relying on the bully pulpits of, cable news or talk radio or political office to sort of just say things and expect that people with very different life experiences are going to agree with them. Like, I'm not afraid of making the sales pitch for democratic values. I'm not afraid of making the sales pitch for liberty and for freedom and for an adherence to the values of the Constitution. You've got to be willing to do that in a way to where it can actually work. And I think that that's something that too many folks on the right have become a little bit lazy in trying to do, because we feel as if these values should be obvious, right? But that's never guaranteed.
Yeah, yeah, but I'm not sure they, you'd hope they'd be obvious, but you would hope that a lot of things are just available and understood to everybody, and it's not necessarily true that that's the case. I want to take this out by going back to your jazz heritage, because I think I have a solution, and you tell me if I'm right, and I'm stealing it from John Coltrane.
Okay.
I love John Coltrane. I discovered him through Miles Davis, and towards the end of his career, he was pushing the very limits of the structure of jazz. And if you listen to a beautiful 20-minute improvisation from John Coltrane, you discover there's a couple rules that hold the band together and hold the song together. But 10 minutes in, you're not so sure that those rules even exist. So there's a couple rules that hold things together, and then there's a lot of improvisation and interaction between the members of the band that creates something more beautiful than you could have written on a piece of paper. And I think that's the process of America, fixing ourselves. There's no end here. We're always going to get better. We always should get better. It's the process that has to be bottom up, because I don't believe that anyone's smart enough to write that song for us. And it's probably this process of reconciliation that you're trying to engender with everything that you're doing.
Right. Yeah.
You buying this?
Yeah, I'm already there. Look, music has always kind of been my metaphor for understanding society, actually, to tell you the truth. And I feel like if the way you speak is not, if you don't speak in a way to where you're sort of like, well, look, if you're playing a song that nobody wants to listen to, you're not playing it the right way. And so we got to think of communication sort of the way we think of music. I mean, there's subjectivity, there's taste, and so forth. Yeah. You can be a good musician and be playing something that some folks aren't going to want to hear. But ultimately, if you have something meaningful you want to get across, we should be willing to employ a little bit of artistry and even a little bit of improvisation in making sure that the message is heard. And in the context of a democratic society, in the context of our democratic republic, it's true. Just like a jazz song, you have the underlying structure. So in a song, you're going to have the chords, you're going to have the changes, you're going to have a tempo which moves up or down or faster or slower, and you're going to have the key that it's set in. But then, and similarly, we've got our constitutional structure. We've got the ballot process. We've got the deliberative processes of the legislature and the Congress and the interaction between the branches of government, et cetera. But within the changes, within the chords, we have the actual improvisation on the melody. We have the conversations that we have in our free spaces through our freedom of association and our right to freedom of speech. We have the actual sort of necessary responsibility as citizens of the United States of America to conduct our political and our social interactions in a way that breeds the preconditions necessary for basic human respect and basic human empathy. And from that, potentially, some reasonable consensus that can be developed around issues that we can actually decide together. That's where the jazz comes in to me. And that's where the passion for democratic life needs to come in, because it's a privilege to be able to do this, man. It's a privilege for me to be able to sit here and talk to you. Like, it really is. Precisely because in this country, we have the opportunity to speak our minds, whether or not somebody else wants to hear it or not. But the flip side of that is that in speaking our mind and saying what we believe, we need to recognize the fact that marks this as a collaborative enterprise in the direction of preserving the health of society. And again, that starts on the individual and the community level. That starts not just with the individual as a voter, but with the individual as a member of society and as a neighbor, as a member of a family, as a member of the small institutions that ultimately level up to provide the base, the foundation upon which our major sorts of political structures, have their life and have their viability. So the sooner we can start looking away from Congress and looking away from the president and so forth as being the main kind of agents of national momentum in this country, and start to take power back in terms of the relationships we have as Americans who are parts of communities, who have the ability to change the foundational conversation and culture in the country, the sooner we'll get back to a place to where the basic structure of society becomes stable and healthy again. So that's what I want to see.
Very small L libertarian.
Yeah.
Be careful. You might be coming over to my tribe soon. But thank you, John, so much. Yeah. If people want to check out your stuff, where do they go?
That's right. Well, first of all, love for people to check out Better Angels. Consider joining us as a member and taking part in these sorts of conversations and collaborations. You can find us at better-angels.org. And you'll also be able to look up the John Wood Jr. Show. Got my own podcast coming up in a couple of weeks. And people who are interested in this movement, this effort to bring Americans together in this way, they can learn more about it there.
Good deal. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.